everyone, and thank you so much for your time. And I'm Beka Bajelidze, a director of the Caucasus and Moldova programs here at the Institute for War and Peace Reporting. It's my privilege to host this meeting with such an extraordinary panel. Welcome, dear speakers. This meeting is interpreted in Georgian, Armenian, and Azerbaijani languages. The session will be in English language. That's the original language of the session. This event is part of IWPR's Rising Above the Fray discussion series. This is made possible with the generous support of the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And with this meeting in this very difficult and tough times, we aim to encourage more and more active, constructive dialogue and discourse over the issue against the background of growing disinformation, increase the flow of independent information, and actually engage local and international voices, independent voices, so we can contribute to this 3 decades old conflict, the resolution, negotiated solution of this conflict. There are very few meetings like this, but gradually this is taking pace, and we see more and more international organizations and independent actors, peace-building practitioners are engaging into this because for all of us, this outburst of the war was a shock. I would like to introduce our distinguished speakers. We are joined today here by Emin Milli. Emin is a founder of Meydan TV, a critical voice. He has an unbelievable story, and Emin is now actually left was forced to leave the country and is living in Berlin, and he founded his independent and critical news outlet Meydan TV there with a group of Azerbaijanis who are also living outside the country in exile. Thank you, Emin, for joining us today. Our another speaker is Laurence. Laurence is the director of the Caucasus program for the Conciliation Resources and is a long-standing peace-building practitioner, as he would like to be mentioned and referred to. Thank you, Laurence. Richard Giragosian is the director of the Regional Studies Center. Richard is I enjoy reading Richard's analysis as a reputable expert, and thank you, Richard, for your time today and for sharing your thoughts and insight about the ongoing situation. My first question will be just very general, and how these 2 countries are going to live in this tight neighborhood, whatever the outcome is for the conflict. There has been so much going around this issue, the Karabakh conflict, on both sides. Armenian media, Armenian social media, Azerbaijani media, the television media and the social media, everywhere there's a hot discussion on this. There's everything. Hatred, manipulation, disinformation, and there's a very little space for a constructive dialogue and discussion. And I wonder how these historical neighbors are going to deal with each other when this one day will end. Laurence, this is to you, and then we'll move to Richard and Emin.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to join this event. Yes, this war, I think, has further thrown back the already very fragile, very narrow space for discussion of coexistence in the region. I think we can acknowledge that possession of Nagorny Karabakh has become the cornerstone around which modern Armenian and Azerbaijani national identities have been formed. And I don't think that will change regardless of the outcome of this war. I think what we can also say is that in 1994, we saw a military solution to the conflict that satisfied Armenian interests, and that did not resolve the conflict. It left this huge legacy, a sense of injustice on the Azerbaijani side, a sense of bitterness and resentment. And I think any military solution today would have the same impact. We could see another 25 years, another lost generation of Armenian-Azerbaijani relations. So I think what's crucial in the broader sense is that societies across this conflict have to deal with these legacies, have to deal with the past that's dividing them. We've seen in recent years the industrial scale of the memory wars between these two nations, and there clearly needs to be a different kind of dialogue between Armenians and Azerbaijanis over the future, not only of their bilateral relations, but of the South Caucasus at large.
Thank you, Laurence. Richard, Armenia took over the Karabakh in 1994, and as Laurence mentioned, there was a sense of injustice for Azerbaijanis, and here it's happening now. So, what could be the solution in the end? How these two nations can coexist together, whatever the outcome of the conflict is?
Following up before getting to your question, I do think this opening question is perhaps the most relevant, the most significant, because it only reiterates the importance of IWPR's work and today's event about the need for dialogue over death and destruction, and the necessity or imperative for a return to sincere diplomacy. But following Laurence's comments first, I would go back several years looking at the devolution, the race to the bottom in discourse, where we've been talking past each other, not to each other. I remember a phrase that no longer applies, a promise to prepare the populations for peace. Frankly, we should have prepared the politicians for peace. And in many ways, going forward, I think we need to make this divorce much more amicable. And the problem here, in terms of the failure to communicate, is it makes track two efforts, people-to-people contact, much harder, but much more important. And I think that's the only way forward. No matter what happens on the battlefield, in terms of the next arena, diplomacy, public diplomacy, and civil society efforts, the burden is on us on both sides to bridge the divide. And actually, we have not yet reached a point of conflict fatigue. And in many ways, the price is already too high. I would like to begin by actually expressing my frustration by deploring the loss of civilian lives, no matter who they are and no matter where they are.
Well, first of all, I think that Armenians and Azerbaijanis can coexist and peacefully live together. And you can see this happening in Georgia, you can see this happening in Russia, in Iran. So it has always been the case. So it's not that, as some politicians in the region have said, that there is ethnic incompatibility or ideas like that. So it is possible. And from what I have seen from Azerbaijani side, there have been statements that Armenians should live in Azerbaijan. So this has been a statement from president to opposition leaders, civil society leaders. And we are, of course, now at the moment where there is no peace, but there is a war. But even now, I personally made the appeal to, on my Facebook to my Azerbaijani audience, and I also asked many other influencers in Azerbaijan, make the appeal that they should talk about avoiding and should send clear message to avoid harming civilian population in this conflict. And this is very important because we all want peace and we all want ceasefire, and there is mutual accusation why it's not happening and so on. But it's very important that there are things we can do now that are real and that can save human lives. And this is what I think everyone should do in Armenia and Azerbaijan. And I'm very glad that Richard made this point that no matter which side is killing civilian population, this should be condemned, and this is unacceptable. So, but when we talk about the conflict itself, why there was no dialogue, no communication, I mean, we have to have honest and conversation about this, and not to avoid these conversations. And in my view, was the case, during many events where sides talked, but as again Richard rightly said, they, everyone talked at each other, but not with each other, didn't hear each other. And the thing is that Armenia for 26 years had this advantageous situation where it was victorious and could use the upper hand to try to bring later Demircan, who actually tried they actually made a point. Now we have this advantage because in 20 years it will be much more difficult. We won't be able to get what we want. And with what happened with Petrosyan, there was coup d'etat, and what happened with Demircan, he was basically killed in the parliament together with Speaker of Armenian Parliament. So here I a little bit disagree with Richard that it's not just about politicians. I think we also need to work with both Armenian and Azerbaijani societies and really talk about how we can imagine the peace, imagine how we can coexist peacefully. And in my view, I know we will talk about it later. I am absolutely against internationalization of this conflict and against basically exaggeration of, let's say, the role of Turkey, or trying to incite this kind of clash between Turkey and Russia, because that's where internationalization comes. And in my view, the West should be guided by post-war peace-building process already now, because it is in Armenians' interest, in Azerbaijan's interest. Peaceful resolution, I think it is possible, but we should be realistic about exactly what happened for last 26 years. That one side back then used its military advantage.
İndi biz hərbi yolla üstünlüğü əldə eləmişdik, biz bunu istifadə edirik.
Ադրբեջանს აქვს სამხედრო ოპერატորობა და ეს առավելություն է ունեցել Ադրբեջանի հանդեպ, հիմա Ադրբեջանի ռազմական առավելություն
told to Azerbaijanis on the level of civil society, but to the government as well, that you need to accept this peace, this reality, and there is no military solution. In fact, as Laurence said, actually in 1994, Armenia came up with a military solution, and that was a problem that we haven't moved beyond that. I hope now we should really try again not to, and I want to finish with my idea about what West should do, that they should be not inciting this standoff between Turkey and Russia, but rather talking to the major players. Azerbaijan should talk directly to Armenia, and Armenia should talk directly to Azerbaijan. And yes, Russia and Turkey should be involved in this conversation as well, but we need to talk about very serious and very specific, solution. Because right now, situation is such that mere call for ceasefire without agreeing on specific moments of how it will look like, unfortunately, will not help.
Thank you. I mean, all of you mentioned public diplomacy, but public diplomacy throughout this time has been grossly discouraged by Azerbaijan. activists who used to communicate with Armenians, mainly meeting in Georgia or in another third countries, they were either discredited, kicked out of the country, or arrested. Is there a future for public diplomacy? Richard, over to you.
Well, from the Armenian side and from the side of Karabakh, it's never been a problem. We've always never had any kind of retribution. To be fair, the space in which we've operated in has always been much more free and much more open than our Azerbaijani interlocutors. And I do think this divergence in democracy is an added layer of complexity, especially after Armenia's revolution. But in terms of our legitimacy, our democratic credentials, it makes the disparity of power with Azerbaijan even greater. But I do think the new reality, where on the one hand, we're into 25 days of nonstop offensive and attacks since the Azerbaijani offensive. And yes, they're gaining ground. The map is changing. But there has to come a point for, after 2 refusals, a third acceptance by Azerbaijan to return to a ceasefire and begin negotiations. Hopefully we have this opportunity coming with a meeting in Washington, followed by hopefully a Moscow summit. But to be honest, there's one problem. It's an interloper. We talked about internationalization, but I blame Turkey for intervening, interfering, and acting as a destructive and dangerous interloper. It is Turkey that is emboldening and empowering a refusal to turn back to diplomacy. Having said that, I think we need to accurately reassess. This is a brand new world. This is a new context. And what it represents potentially is an opportunity where none of the previous calculations or expectations apply. We talked about concession and compromise. The ultimate aim or objective, of course, is a scenario where everyone loses in order to win. In other words, concession and compromise across the board. I also think Nagorny Karabakh is at war with Azerbaijan. It's not Armenia directly. I think this also changes the dynamic of the diplomatic formula. And it might be worth exploring direct communication and negotiations between Stepanakert and Baku on whatever level. At the same time, what we see is Emin has a very good suggestion. We need to return to the precedent of the 90s. We need to have diplomatic meetings back where they belong, on the border, in the region, and no longer limited to Vienna or Sochi. We need to localize this conflict because at the end of the day, the only solution is based on local indigenous formulas and much less an externally imposed formula. But at the same time, I'm frustrated. I'm frustrated that in this wave of emotion, military breakthrough, gaining ground, the intensity of this fighting is actually driving us further apart. And I am worried that in the next several months, even after a ceasefire, the risk of renewed fighting will return. And this is what I'm greatly worried about.
Laurence, what are those local formulas, indigenous solutions? And is there a role for public diplomacy in this? Can the public diplomacy play a powerful role once again, or eventually?
Yeah, I mean, I very much agree with what Richard was saying, that this has been hugely damaging. We've seen even those fragile networks and relationships that have been built up over the last few years, damaged and ruptured once again as a result of this war. But I think we should be clear-eyed about what civil society-led peace building has been able and has not been able to do over the last decade. There hasn't been serious investment in the peace process at large from political elites, I would say, since 2011 at the very latest. So over the last decade, the context has been completely dominated by the security dynamic, particularly since 2014, regular skirmishing and escalation. Since 2016, there's been no access to Nagorny Karabakh for peace-building practitioners. And this underlines, I think, a key element. Those people who are most directly affected by this conflict don't have a voice in the process to resolve it. That concerns the population in Nagorny Karabakh, the Armenian population. It also concerns the Karabakh Azerbaijani population and other displaced communities from the territories around Nagorny Karabakh. This has been an incredibly top-down process, and it's been led largely by authoritarian leaders who've given very little space to civil society practitioners to articulate a different vision. So in terms of going forward, I mean, just to reinforce my earlier point, societies are going to have to participate and own this process if it is going to be seen as legitimate, and if it is going to address the fundamental identity concerns, concerns about representation, concerns about voice that have basically been neglected over the past decades. And so, you know, it's inevitable that civil society has to be brought back in. And I very much hope that whatever the outcome of this, that this will be recognized, that new relationships will be able to be formed, but it's going to be immensely challenging. But without participation, you don't have legitimacy. I think that's a key lesson from the past decade or more of this process.
I mean, whatever the outcome is of this war that's ongoing at the moment, there is a question for legitimacy, because the process is not participatory, as Laurence highlighted. And Azerbaijani government has been strictly limiting the participation of independent actors in this. What do you think? Is there a potential in Azerbaijan for local formulas and indigenous formulas to propose for the negotiated solution of this?
Well, I think, you know, I've read interview with Vanyan. He was one of few voices in Armenia who was actually, you know, pro-compromise, you know, pro-dialogue with Azerbaijan. And he said something which catched my attention. He said at the end of the interview, he said, "I failed as a peacemaker." And I think everyone who wanted peace and dialogue, you know, for the last 26 years, we all failed as peacemakers. And I think this is, again, it's not, I don't want, you know, to take, you know, one side against the other side, but it is not that there was a problem, you know, with Aliyev and he was limiting the peace process. There were a lot of elements in this peace process that, in my opinion, were not genuine, were not talking and hearing both sides. And it has been, let's be honest, it was difficult. I told you about Ter Petrosyan, who tried to talk to Armenian society as a president, as politician, and there was this coup d'etat. And then you had Demircan, and then he was killed. And then you had Karabakh clan, who we had, you know, Kocharyan, who was saying that ethnically Azerbaijans, Armenians are incompatible with each other, or Sarkisyan, another leader, president, who was saying that, you know, basically justifying massacre against Azerbaijan civil population in interview with Tom Deval. And then when Pashinyan came, so I want to say that also you have to understand it was putting, it was very difficult in this kind of discourse and framework, you know, for even to start talking about peace. It was very difficult and it was stopping a lot of people. So it wasn't just, you know, something coming from the government, you know. And then Pashinyan came. When Pashinyan came, there was a hope in Azerbaijan that finally it's someone not from Karabakh clan, that finally, and I think the first meeting with Aliyev was quite positive, you know, and there was expectations were very high. But very soon Pashinyan started having internal problems with Karabakh clan. So he tried to show himself even more, you know, tough guy than Karabakh clan. And then it started, the statements he made that, Karabakh is Armenia, then it was perceived in Azerbaijan, and not just by Aliyev, it's important to say, by opposition, civil society, every average Azerbaijani thought, if Karabakh is Armenia, as Pashinyan said in Karabakh, in Khankendi or Stepanakert, why did we waste 26 years even talking about what is the subject of compromise? Why did we waste 26 years, on talking about nothing? And then you had the former, the Minister of Defense, Tonoyan, last year, basically, coming up with his new military doctrine, new war for new territories. So the discourse changed, and it was, and then you had the July events, where it was a continuation of this escalation, provocations, attacks, that, the conflict started going beyond Karabakh, Tovuz, next to oil pipeline, and, whatever you can say about Aliyev, but he is extremely pragmatic politician. I don't think he would be interested, in trying to fight. Even now, Azerbaijani armed forces, they try not to enter Armenian territory, Armenian state territory, because we all know that they have a military agreement with Russia, and there is military base of Russia in Armenia, and we don't want to provoke Russia. But then this kind of logic, it was escalating, provoking, and then, of course, there were in summer 30,000 people on the street, and it was not orchestrated by Aliyev or whatever. In my view, Aliyev was, for a very long time, a peacekeeper. He was trying to contain this kind of humiliation, and this that was hugely underestimated. I know that people like Laurence and Tom Deval talked about it, but at large, it was totally underestimated. And there was this kind of push that we want to go home. There is this humanitarian dimension. Hundreds of thousands of Azerbaijanis are not at home. They have been forced to leave, and any solution needs to consider that these people should come back home. And of course, there was excellent idea on the table. And I know that Richard also supported that, giving back 5 territories, 5 occupied territories. So Azerbaijan, Turkey opens the borders, and then, trust building measures start, and then, everything starts. Because at the moment, how it was boxed, how everything was boxed, it was impossible really to seriously talk about peacemaking and peace process, despite of all the good efforts of people like Laurence and Tom Deval and others and similar organizations, because, there was this feeling of injustice and humiliation, and these hundreds of thousands of people who feel like this is our international recognized territory, this is our home, and we have been forced away from this home. There is this UN Security Council resolutions. Why nothing is happening? And I think the role of Europe and of the West, especially in this, even now, I think peace is possible, but we should talk to Armenian society and Armenian politicians and Armenian diaspora, because they are also, in my view, they're playing very destructive role. And again, the entire talk right now, because if we talk about what is really disturbing now, the beginning of the peaceful process, the beginning of this genuine dialogue is, this, and I know Richard just mentioned the role of Turkey. In my view, it is extremely exaggerated. Yes, Azerbaijan is, has political support from Turkey.
We will move to that issue of regional powers and their possible role in this. Thank you, Emin. And you mentioned the messaging that the statement of the Prime Minister of Armenia has irritated Azerbaijani government and the people, and this irritation was demonstrated in July when lots of people gathered in Baku. But there are also other messages coming recently that I personally, also following this conflict for decades, didn't quite hear before. And this message is from Azerbaijan proposing Armenians to stay in Karabakh and co-live with Azerbaijanis. How likely, how possible is that? Richard, over to you.
Well, frankly, it's not possible. I have to be honest. This is, for all of our viewers and participants, today is not a debate on purpose. Rather, it's a time for reflection and analysis. But I would say that there are two important perspectives from the Armenian side. One is, for us, Nagorny Karabakh can no longer be ignored or marginalized. We cannot pretend that people don't live there. And there is a sense that we need to engage, and not necessarily in terms of a unilateral surrender demand. What we also see from the Armenian perspective, the Armenian casualties proportionally are greater than all the US deaths from the Vietnam War. It is that much of an impact on our society. Death has touched too many families on both sides. But in Armenia, we are very small compared to our neighbors, and the impact has actually poisoned the well. It's going to take us a long time to recover psychologically. What that means is what to do. I would say Azerbaijan and the Turkish forces must stop the indiscriminate bombardment and shelling of civilian population centers. Military targets are one thing, but the shelling of Stepanakert, in terms of the siege of Stalingrad psychology, the indiscriminate attacks against civilian targets, and then the retribution. This has to stop. Otherwise, we are moving further apart. At the same time, beyond that, we need to abide by the ceasefire or cessation of hostilities. The Azerbaijani frustration, I understand, but I don't understand the refusal to go in and retrieve their own corpses, the fallen Azerbaijani soldiers. Because the wider implication here, and what's literally poisoning the well, is the humanitarian catastrophe. In addition to COVID-19, a surge in infections because of
impacts
quarters and bomb shelters in Azerbaijani cities in Nagorny Karabakh, a surge of humanitarian concerns. This is going to be a bigger problem where any attempt at re-engagement, at reconciliation is going to face challenges. This is why it is imperative to stop, agree to a cessation of hostilities, and then we can begin to plant the seeds for the future relationship. Otherwise, we are poisoned in terms of the hate speech and the rhetoric, whether it's President, we're going to run away like dogs, or this kind of threatening bellicose rhetoric, or inflammatory language from other sides. But at the same time, I think it's going to get worse, because where we are today is at a turning point. The Azerbaijani military advance now approaching Lachin. There is a crossroads. If Azerbaijan continues a military offensive at districts outside of Nagorny Karabakh, that's one thing. However, if the attacks turn into direct assaults against Nagorny Karabakh proper or against Armenia, we're going to see a further escalation. And this is what I'm worried about, this turning point right now. And for that, I have no answer, other than a realistic appraisal that right now, there is no likelihood of even coexistence. And that's what worries me.
Laurence, this conflict has been operating in the framework of zero-sum games. Someone's winning, someone's losing, someone was proud of achieving something, someone was really losing something and victimized about it. In such a situation with such mindsets around in the governments and in the largest part of the civil society community, how we can all and what we can propose to overcome this mindset.
Yeah, well, I think that's absolutely right. There are zero-sum outlooks on this. I mean, with regards to coexistence, which is the kind of ultimate expression of compromise in a way, when that's framed in zero-sum terms, it's very hard to get to a discussion about the reciprocal benefits and all the other things that become possible if communities can coexist. But I think what I want to say here is that even before this war started, I think Azerbaijan had what I would call a credible commitment problem. President Aliyev had committed to the highest level of autonomy in the world, but there had never been a document or a white paper, a briefing that would lay out what kind of rights Azerbaijan was willing to delegate to a community in Nagorny Karabakh. Unlike in Georgia, where there were civil society working groups that generated very concrete proposals that were published in the newspaper 24 Hours in the mid-2000s. So, you know, we had the rhetoric, but we didn't have any detail. And unfortunately, a number of signals over the last 3 weeks, I think, have only consolidated and confirmed Armenian fears that the rhetoric of coexistence is just that, rhetoric. There have been reliable, credible reports of civilians being killed, residual civilians who were not evacuated in Hadrut were executed. Settlements that are within the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast, the former space of the oblast, have been renamed with Azerbaijani names. And there are videos of cultural monuments suffering, which suggests that you know, an Armenian cultural identity in Nagorny Karabakh is under threat. And I think, you know, the messages that these acts transmit to the population in Nagorny Karabakh are absolutely critical. When we think of the basic principles, the core proposal that's on the table, and which presumably would be the framework to which talks would return, one of the basic principles is an interim status for the territory of the former oblast. Now that Azerbaijan has recaptured some of these areas in Matagis, in Hadrut area, the question arises of whether those would be included in any interim status. And that's very difficult to see, I think. If there are now military strikes on the Lachin corridor, which is another of the basic principles, we lose the basis for understanding how this interim status might work, and therefore the return, the prospects for a return to the basic principles. So I think, you know, what the Azerbaijani leadership communicates now in terms of these signals is very crucial as to whether Armenian fears of an existential struggle are substantiated or not. So that's something that I think needs to be considered very carefully in order for us to move on from this zero-sum win-lose mentality to the prospect for coexistence, which seems very far off right now.
Would you like to respond to this?
So, well, I disagree. I understand that it will be very difficult to coexist. I mean, there are wounds when we have to heal these wounds, but we have to do two things. I think first, there should be a serious, you know, conversation, international conversation at this point, both to Armenian and Azerbaijani side, coming to the kind of common ground, first of all, on humanitarian and human dimension part of the things, that civilian population should not be touched and should not be harmed, no matter what happens on the battleground. And Richard Laurence talked about shelling in Stepanakert, about executing people in Hadrut. It is happening mutually, and this is another important thing. When we talk about these things, we have to be very careful. Okay, there have been rockets hitting cities beyond Karabakh, like Ganja, second biggest city in Azerbaijan, where dozens of people, including children, have been killed. It was residential area. There was nothing military in this entire area. And this, yes, must be stopped, but from both sides, not just from one side. And again, to realistically make this happen, there should be a serious international effort which will talk to both sides and talk sense to both sides. Because what's happening now, very dangerous game is played by, again, exaggerating the role of Turkey. And it's very, very important. This is a problem here, that Azerbaijani side has been underestimated by Armenia and by international community, because there was this thinking that Azerbaijan stayed in 90s with these, disorganized military groups and commandos. That's not the case. And again, Levon Ter-Petrosyan was foreseeing it, and the balance of power has shifted. And of course, we had to deal with this within this 26 years, but we haven't, and we have now the result. And now we have to be very careful, because what I see, and we're going to talk about it, about all the disinformation, manipulation, speculation, but what is not helping peace, I can tell you what is not really helping peace, is again, exaggerating the role of Turkey. If Turkey would be involved in this war with Armenia, with second largest standing troops in NATO, and with 600,000 soldiers, Armenia wouldn't be able to fight even 5 minutes back, So this is hugely exaggeration. It doesn't exist. The Turkey has a moral and political support. Yes, there have been trainings, like, Armenia has been trained by Russian army. Azerbaijan army was getting, training from Turkey. It was buying weapons from Turkey and from Russia, like Armenia was buying, weapons, even subsidized from Russia. So this is very important, not to, because, by dragging Turkey into this, exaggerating the role that Turkey plays, trying, which Armenia is doing. And a lot of people, I think, in European Union and in US and in expert community are just falling into this trap. And then there is another trap that Armenia is trying to do on the ground, again, to drag Russia into this war. I mean, Russia has been behaving very suspiciously neutrally, and I think it should stay that way, because if it doesn't stay that way, then we really have a problem of internationalization of this conflict. And if we talk about real solution, not dreams, not some unrealistic proposals, I think we should be, we should look at balance of power, at reality. That's exactly what everyone told to Azerbaijani civil society members, including me, and on government levels, that Azerbaijan should accept the reality. Look, there is a reality, and there is this shift of power on the ground. There is blurring alliances on the ground. And at this moment, in my view, if we want really to stop bloodshed, okay, not to pay lip service, as many politicians around the world do now, and taking one side against the other side, but really to achieve peace, we should bring Aliyev and Pashinyan together, or ministers of foreign affairs, and then talk about how we make sure that territorial integrity of Azerbaijan is ensured, and B, how we ensure that Armenian civilian population is not harmed in any way, is not touched, and how we can give international guarantees, including, I agree with Laurence, discussion in very detail of what kind of guarantees it will be, what kind of model. And because if it's not about land grab,
I have to intervene here as we are approaching the end of the session. Sorry.
Then we should put
Make your last point.
Of civilian population of both communities as a priority, and not ending up in these mutual accusations.
Here's the question. What are 3 key scenarios for the post-war, post-coronavirus life in the region? Let's begin with Richard. Thank you.
Let me start with the most distressing scenario, and it may be the most likely. Frankly, even if we get to a ceasefire, there will be a test of diplomacy through the winter months where the weather prevents military offensive operations, meaning that if diplomacy doesn't work, by February and March, I think the war is going to continue. And I think Azerbaijan is tempted to try to retake all of Nagorny Karabakh and all of the territories. Frankly, that's even a larger war because, in my opinion, I don't see any scenario where Nagorny Karabakh voluntarily returns to Azerbaijan. The territories are quite different. And a second scenario would be internal domestic instability in both countries. President Aliyev is playing a dangerous game. He's riding the tiger of war. Expectations in Azerbaijan are quite high. And militarily, every leader before President Aliyev has come to power or has fallen from power because of events on the battlefield over Nagorny Karabakh. There's also a record and precedent of a military coup in Azerbaijan in the 90s. I'm concerned as well for domestic stability within Armenia, because in many ways, this is as powerful as 9/11 was to the Americans. And in many ways, we see Turkey resurrecting fears of genocide. And I think it's Turkey that, as a military analyst, I'm not exaggerating the presence of the F-16s and the operational use of the Turkish military drones. I think this is the big factor. Finally, a third scenario, one that would harm everyone. If and because Turkey is such a threat to us in our survival, we may turn to Russia for peacekeepers. That would be a devastating and serious blow to everyone because there's no such thing as Russian peacekeepers. And once they deploy, they never go home. But given the Turkish threat, we have no choice. This is the third scenario. None of these are good scenarios. None of them are optimistic. In many ways, I'm no longer the optimist I once was. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Let's make sure that we answer this question within 2 minutes, not more, because we have questions coming from the attendees. Thank you. Laurence?
Okay, I just want to clarify, I mentioned the civilian deaths in Hadrut in reference in the context of the previous question, which was the question of coexistence. But of course, I join Richard and Emin in condemning all attacks on civilians, including those in Ganja and various towns in Nagorny Karabakh. In terms of scenarios, how this plays out, I think there is the kind of the military pathway, either a complete military victory for one side or the other, with all of the problems, including domestic instability and another generation lost to normalizing Armenian-Azerbaijani relations. The second scenario would be the regionalization of the conflict process, which would suggest that Russia and Turkey, notwithstanding Emin's comments that we are over-exaggerating the role of Turkey, I think it's one thing to discuss Turkey's active participation in this conflict, but Turkey's capacity to penetrate the South Caucasus, and for the South Caucasus and this conflict theater in particular to become one of a number of different theaters where Russia and Turkey are negotiating in a sense, sometimes as rivals, sometimes as partners, and squeezing out Euro-Atlantic actors. The third scenario is essentially a kind of a revival of multilateral diplomacy, the re-embedding of this conflict within a peace process that would now pay more attention to all of the things that we've been talking about in this session around participation, around voice, around guarantees, and so on. That is a difficult scenario at present to foresee. But events are very fast moving. And obviously, I hope that it will be that option. But I think I share Richard's possibly pragmatic pessimism.
Thank you, Laurence. Emin?
Yeah, thank you. I want to say that I want us to imagine peace, and I disagree again that Azerbaijanis and Armenians cannot coexist together. I think that we have to take the reality on the ground, and I think that Azerbaijani leadership will not make the mistake that many Armenian leaders did when they had upper hand in this conflict, militarily speaking. They didn't reach out to the other side. I hope that from our even conversation today, I want to take the point that we should develop a very specific proposal about how Armenian and Azerbaijani civil population can coexist peacefully together, and it should be a very specific plan. So I take the critical point from Laurence, and I think the Azerbaijani authorities should also listen to this. And we as civil society should try to come up with this independently as well, and hopefully it can help. On the other hand, I think that Armenia should also start thinking about, you cannot endlessly be in a hostile relationship with, 2-3 out of your 5 neighbors. Okay, Armenia should imagine and consider becoming a sustainable state, a peaceful partner to its neighbors, not claiming their territories, and also, trying to think more about how it can peacefully coexist, make business, trade, how it's possible, and not just, staying a mere military base for Russian troops. I think that this strategy of security for Armenia, where they were very proud of their military advantages and victories, and not compromising, not reaching out to Azerbaijani side, and just hoping that Russia will always back them because Russia has military base there, because there are very close relationships between Armenia and Russia. So this should end, and they should open up and be open for dialogue. And again, I think that President of Azerbaijan and Armenia should meet and talk directly, and hopefully not make the mistake that previous leaders and Pashinyan himself and all of these leaders made in the past. They should be the way out of it, but EU and US, so Western partners, really should focus on how they can, on post-war peace building. It's very important how we can, again, make sure that the territories of both states are respected and both communities, Azerbaijani and Armenian civil population, can live together, how it can be guaranteed, because this is the key and this is the core of the problem.
Thank you, Emin. We have questions from participants, and I tried to factor in some of them in my questions to you, and I hope they have been answered. I'll read out some of them that I think are important and have not been mentioned in our discussion. Here's the question from Hans Gutbrod. For those of us who have watched the war in Bosnia, there are grim similarities. There already seem to be atrocities, but no accountability. This gives rise to a fear of ethnic cleansing, maybe even a Srebrenica. Given that risk, what is the role and especially the responsibility of intellectuals on both sides? Let's take a turn. Richard, Laurence, and Emin.
Well, I think this is a very good question, but for the very bad reason that it needs to be raised. I think atrocities with the lack of accountability is already what we see. It also reflects a dangerous breakdown in military discipline in terms of beheadings and mistreatment. But it raises a bigger issue. R2P, responsibility to protect, is also responsibility to persecute, to prosecute. And in many ways, I expect negatively even more atrocities. Tensions, emotions are running high and running out of control. And I really think we can't talk about the post-war scenario because I'm not sure we're going to survive the current war. It is that much of an existential threat. And from an Armenian position, this is where perception matters more than reality. The threat could be exaggerated, but unfortunately, it's the perception that matters most. And I don't see anyone trying to de-escalate or disengage, just the opposite. Russia is uncharacteristically passive. Turkey is unprecedentedly active. And I think the US is disappeared. I think the absence and the vacuum of statesmanship is also exacerbated by the divergence in democracies. We're a small, beleaguered, landlocked country with problems with most of our neighbors, yet we're the underdog as a democracy. Compared to father to son genetic legitimacy in Baku and a sultanate in Turkey. And I think this is only going to encourage even further unacceptable atrocities and ethnic cleansing.
Thank you for the question. I mean, I think there is a tradition of impunity for war crimes, for atrocities, for grave human rights violations that goes back to the 1990s and in some cases even before that. That impunity in the Armenian-Azerbaijani context has never been seriously challenged. There's never been an international criminal tribunal of the kind that there was for Yugoslavia. And so that sense of impunity continues. And I've raised this risk of renewed ethnic cleansing that would only compound the terrible legacies of the ethnic cleansing that took place on both sides in the early 1990s. So, you know, the breakthrough for justice would be to leave this cycle, to break this cycle. Unfortunately, as I was saying earlier, a lot of the signals are pointing in the other direction. I agree with Richard that there is, I think, very grave risk now, and with specific regards to the role of intellectuals, which was mentioned in the question. At the other end of all of this, I mean, I think intellectuals are going to be held, in a sense, accountable for having contributed to or been a part of these narrative structures of exclusion, of reciprocal mutual exclusion and hatred, which have been disseminated across societies, which are taught in schools, reproduced in speech acts, and so on. Intellectuals have not, or only in very small number and as exceptions, kind of spoken out against that, challenged that. And I think that will be the key question posed to them at the other end of this. So yes, I think breaking the impunity cycle is crucial, and the international community can contribute to that through much more forthright setting down of the red lines, going beyond expressions of concern, and clearly a role for international jurisdiction, hopefully when this crisis ends.
Thank you, Laurence. Emin, and we have 3 more questions and we'll be done. I'm sorry, we are slightly over 1 hour. We'll take another maybe 10 minutes more.
War crimes must be condemned, and killing of civilian population is unacceptable, no matter which side is doing it and for whatever reason. And I personally did raise my voice publicly in the middle of all this hysteria, saying that under no circumstances, it was my appeal to public, to government, to Azerbaijani army, that under no circumstances Azerbaijani soldiers and army should harm any civil Armenian population. And I didn't do just that. So I wrote about it, post about it. So there were about 2,300 likes. And yes, there were about also 300 angry faces. So absolute majority from my small, not representative kind of attitude to this, I can say that the absolute majority of Azerbaijan society thinks that this is unacceptable, first. Second, if you talk on the level of government, President Aliyev continuously repeated, you know, even after shelling of Ganja and killing children and women, and it's not an easy position to present in Azerbaijan right now, but on the level of the government, Aliyev said, you know, we are fighting our fight on the battlefield. We are not going to take revenge or do anything to civilian population. Any influencer or civil society leader or opposition leader I know and I read of basically send the same message. And the prevalent message in Azerbaijan is, it's not about Azerbaijanis do not have any problems with Armenians, there was never a problem. The problem was, from Azerbaijan perspective, that somebody comes into your house, wants to grab part of your territory, and we're not going back into history, what belonged to whom, when, and so on. But, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there were just these borders, okay? And from Azerbaijan perspective, someone, to whatever reason, tries to take it away and then forces hundreds of thousands of people leave your homes. So, and this is where I think realistically, again, international community, you can play a big role into, not again engaging in things that will not bring results, but really bring together Armenian and Azerbaijan president and take into consideration the reality on the ground, what Azerbaijan has been always advised for 26 years. So now really both Azerbaijan and Armenia should take the reality on the ground into consideration. And then based on that, come to a solution. And solution is possible. It is possible to prevent any killing of any civilian population right now if Pashinyan and Armenian side find courage and if international community, instead of kind of inciting this standoff between Turkey and Russia, try to come together around the table and agree on two things. How we can make sure that these two countries respect their borders and make sure that civilian population in both communities can live peacefully and coexist peacefully. This is possible. And that's the only right way out of this.
Thank you. I mean, here's another question. What role you think Georgia can play in mediation and potentially peacekeeping? Georgia is also the country affected by two conflicts, and there are lots of similarities as I'm listening to all of you. And has Georgia also tried, and the government of Georgia tried to offer a platform for discussion? So what role do you think it can play? Potentially peacekeeping? The question mark.
The short answer is Georgia should not play any role whatsoever. I am adamant that Georgia is in an impossible position. It's being dragged in two separate directions. Armenia expects Georgian neutrality or an end to the overflight of the Turkish military resupply of weapons that are going through Georgian airspace. Azerbaijan, because of SOCAR and the energy interests, are also expecting Georgian support. I think Georgia would lose a great deal more by any kind of mediation attempt that unfortunately would put it in a more precarious position. Having said that, a peacekeeping role would only worsen the confrontation for Georgia and expose the Georgian military to greater vulnerability. I think we, Armenia, Nagorny Karabakh, Azerbaijan, we need to initiate, to reach out to Georgia, to play a constructive, perhaps not mediating role, but offer a venue, a third-party trusted broker. But the initiative has to come from us, and we're not ready yet. If it comes from Georgia, it will be immediately rejected, but also expose Georgia to this dueling expectations from both sides. So the short answer is, if I was Tengiz or other friends in Tbilisi, I would not advise such a risk.
Thank you. Laurence?
Yeah, no, I pretty much agree with Richard's analysis. I think Georgia's in this very difficult, paradoxical situation that it's probably the country that has the most to lose from a large-scale Armenian-Azerbaijani war, but has very little influence. Obviously, there are lots of complicating factors. Normatively, Georgia's position on conflicts in general is much closer to Azerbaijan's. And so, the extent to which Yerevan would see Tbilisi as genuinely neutral on those issues is in doubt. So I think, what Georgia does offer, in a sense, is a venue for dialogue, particularly for civil society processes. And it also offers the example of Armenians and Azerbaijanis living side by side. It offers that model of coexistence, but that model, in a sense, is very much at risk of being disrupted by expanded conflict. So Georgia's civic nationhood, in a sense, is threatened by any radicalization of Armenian-Azerbaijani relations within its borders. So I think, yes, Georgia is a kind of not really able to influence or to offer much in the way of mediation, just quiet support to each side.
Thank you, Laurence. Emin?
Well, I think that Georgia can play and is playing actually a positive role already, because Georgia, stopped Georgia's government position was to stop and not allow any shipment from Russia, to Armenia of any, weapons or anything under humanitarian, disguised under humanitarian aid. So that was very good. So Georgia basically tries to keep balanced its position and not to help one or the other side. Second, Georgia's, again, as Laurence said, the peaceful coexistence of Armenians and Armenians and Azerbaijanis in Georgia is a very good example. And I think once the ceasefire will come and we will move towards more, peace negotiations, of course, Georgia's territory can play a role of a neutral kind of venue where, both parties can come. And also there is this inspiration and a model for Azerbaijanis, of possibility of Azerbaijanis and Armenians peacefully coexisting together.
Thank you, Emin. And the last question, and we will close this webinar. If the confrontation ends up with Russian peacekeeping monitoring mission in Karabakh, how is it going to affect the security paradigm in the South Caucasus region?
Well, as I stated before, it would be a grave mistake. From an Armenian Karabakh perspective, the threat from Turkey may drive us in that direction, but it would be a strategic mistake. I think any further expansion of Russian power and influence will greatly undermine Armenian and Karabakh aspirations for independence, as well as undermining or derailing regional security and stability. Just as Turkey is the destructive interloper, Russia, if it comes into the region more, it's going to be very negative and a strategic challenge for everyone. I think this is the only point of agreement between Karabakh, Azerbaijan, and Armenia in the past, but I also think for a good reason.
Laurence?
Yeah, I mean, if there's one thing that Armenia and Azerbaijan and Nagorny Karabakh can agree on, it's that they don't want Russian boots on the ground. Russian peacekeeping experience elsewhere in the former Soviet Union has been a negative one particularly for the parent state involved. So that may have an impact of inducing, it emphasizes the need for an end game to this conflict that's happening right now that wouldn't create that opening. Now that may have a radicalizing impact, saying, well, we have to have complete control so that there's no question of a peacekeeping operation, or it means arriving at a plan B scenario where reciprocal security can be guaranteed without the presence of an exclusive Russian peacekeeping force. And that also speaks to the need for a revival in multilateral input and commitment to this process, because only a multinational force with a serious commitment from other players, Euro-Atlantic players, would avoid that negative kind of Russian monopoly. So we're kind of back at that chicken and egg situation. We need more security to enable the parties to move to substantive talks, but we need a political commitment from the parties in order for outsiders to commit security, to commit to contributing to a new security architecture. And that's the dilemma that we're in right now.
Emin?
Yeah, I think that at this point, again, if we have little time, little energy, little resources, if we want to focus on one thing to bring peace back and find peaceful resolution, I think it should come from direct dialogue between two leaders, and it should be also involvement of international community in a sense of starting taking into consideration the reality, something they've loved to repeat for many, many years, and then come to a very specific plan how peace will look like. And then put pressure both on Armenian and Azerbaijan kind of to make this peace deal. And I understand the skepticism of Richard and maybe other experts, but I think it is possible, and that could be the only game changer, because otherwise, you know, it can go on with unpredictable consequences for both sides, with, you know, involvement of foreign troops on these territories, and basically damaging security, prosperity, and peace, again, long-term for both sides. So direct talks, peace talks, and a very specific plan about respect of territories of both countries, and guarantees for peaceful coexistence of Armenian and Azerbaijan population.
Thank you, Emin. We spent 1 hour and 20 minutes discussing this issue. It actually requires more, but we'll have similar events in the coming days. And today we have a panel of mainly men. Next time we'll try to invite women experts on this issue, and hope it will work out. I would like to thank our distinguished speakers for their excellent insights. Thank you so much for your participation and time. This event is again part of our regional project, Giving Voice, Driving Change from the Borderland to Steppes, funded by the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I would like also to thank our attendees who stayed with us without leaving the platform, more than 100 participants, for their loyalty and listening to these excellent speakers. Thank you so much. We'll make this session available in edited version on IWPR website. Please follow us. We'll let you know. Thank you.